So when it comes to writing the essay, you don't just sit down with a pen and start writing at the introduction and finish at the conclusion. What you do is you think about what needs to go into the essay and you prepare it in dot points. So you might write out the content or the keywords in a draft form, and then later on, when you've grouped the information into introduction, paragraphs, and conclusion, you'll write it out into full sentences and worry about phrasing and things like that. But first, the most important thing is just to think about the content you need to put in there. So the structure of your comparative essay, you'll start with the introduction. You address the question using some keywords from that question and define your comparison type and the reasons for it. So your question might be, why are these two texts worthy of study? So you know that when you write your answer, you're going to use the phrase worthy of study, okay, to make sure that the marker knows you've really listened to the question. Another thing you're going to do is define your comparison type. So if we pick two random texts, say we're going to study Shrek and Cinderella, we might say that the reason for the comparison is because they have similar genre or even similar content and themes. Then you're going to name the text with the year that each was published in brackets after the name. So you would write, say, Shrek, brackets, 2001, close bracket, and then keep on writing about it. Now, when you bring up Shrek again, you don't need to write 2001 after it, only in the first moment when you're sort of orienting the reader in the introduction. The next thing you're going to do is indicate the genre, the text type, and the composer. So you might say that the genre is either fantasy or a fairy tale. The text type might be animated film, and the composer is either going to be the director of the text or the person who wrote the text. So with films, it's the director. With all other text types, it tends to be the person who wrote it. Then you're going to give a brief summary of each text's cultural context, generally no more than a sentence for each text. So this helps people to understand why the text was made and what was influencing it at the time. So if we're talking about Cinderella, we might say that's a fairy story from the 1800s in England, and you might talk a little bit about class structure in the 1800s and how it might influence the romantic notion of a young girl, who is of low birth, ending up with the prince. If you're doing the same thing for Shrek, you might think, well, 2001 is still influenced by the late 90s and the preoccupation with minority points of view and how they might get left out. So it tends to be about, not calling people ugly and accepting it, and an ogre who would normally be the villain of the tale becomes the hero. So you can see how that's very much related to the context of the late 90s, early 2000s. The next thing you want to do is explain why the two texts go well together. So that's not just, again, identifying the comparison. So you wouldn't just say, oh, because they're both fairy tales. It's got to be more to it than that. So you're going to justify the text set for study. So you might say something along the lines of, Cinderella has been remade thousands of times in all different versions. It's one of the sort of most popular fairy tales, and it's very influential in notions of how young women view themselves and marriage and things like that. So you might say that's a valuable reason to look at Cinderella. When you're looking at Shrek, you might say that it's valuable because it looks at late 90s notions of what a hero is and what power structures are, and also looks at maybe what notions of women are, because Princess Fiona isn't exactly your normal princess waiting to be rescued. So when you're thinking about those things, you're going to say not just why you've chosen to compare them, but what each text have that is valuable. The last part you do in an introduction is called signposting. So that's when you identify the main areas that you're going to discuss. So in your comparative essay, you'll probably have about 3 or 4 paragraphs, and you want to think about what the topic sentence of each of those paragraphs is going to be and introduce them in order. So you want to make sure that you have very clearly and logically laid out what you're going to argue about and what you're going to say before you start doing it. So then you'll get to the paragraphs, and each paragraph is going to have a very similar formulaic structure so that people can easily understand your argument and know where you're going with it. So the first thing you'll have is a topic sentence. So you're going to introduce either the theme or the convention which connects the two texts. So if we're looking at Shrek, we might be looking at notions of a princess, might be one. So you might compare Cinderella and Fiona. Then you might explain how text 1 treats the idea and link it to its contextual values. So you might think about, with Cinderella, you always do the older text first, just out of convention. So we'll start with Cinderella. So you might be thinking about how notions of women were kind of passive in those days, and women didn't really have a lot of freedom. So it doesn't seem as though Cinderella has a lot of choice. She's good, and she kind of just listens to what her older sisters say and to her mother and doesn't really fight back. So maybe that's one view of women. Then, as always in an essay, you're going to name a technique and quote that support this. Then you're going to explain how text 2 treats the idea and link it to its contextual values. So if we're looking at Shrek, we might look at, the fact that Fiona's really good at martial arts, and basically that in some ways she seems even more buff and strong than Shrek. So that's looking at the changing role of women in society. So you can link that to late 90s views of sort of like third wave feminism. Then again, you're going to name a technique and quote from text 2 to support it. So you can't really say anything about the text without coming up with a quote that proves that what you've said is true. Then you're going to explain the message of each text and comment on the similarities or differences. So obviously they both see women who undergo a transformation, one from kind of like rags to riches and the other from beautiful to ugly, but more accepting of herself. And so then you'll be able to say it's similar because both women end up happier, but obviously different in terms of how the women are either active or passive in becoming happier. And then linking it back to the question, you'll have to say that, because it has these important messages for young women and fairy tales are so influential with young people, it's therefore worthy for study. So you'd come back to the question always in the conclusion sentence of every paragraph. So you're going to do about 3 or 4 paragraphs that are going to cover different topics, and then you'll come to your conclusion. When you get there, you want to use some words like finally or ultimately to create a tone of finality. Don't say in conclusion because it sounds quite babyish, so you want to kind of suggest that you're coming to a natural close rather than flat out telling us. Refer back to the question keywords and make sure you've definitely answered the question. Now in an essay, you pretty much want to answer the question up front in the introduction. By the time I've read that, I should know your point of view and what you're going to argue. But you want to make sure in the conclusion that you've just finalized it and made sure that people have understood that's what you've said. You're also going to explain the ultimate message of each text and their significance. So the ultimate message of Cinderella might be that being good prospers and being bad means that you don't prosper. The ultimate message of Shrek is that it's really important to be yourself no matter what other people think of you. So that would be what we mean by an ultimate text. Significance is really what the conclusion is all about. A lot of people will tell you that the conclusion is about repeating what you've said in the rest of the essay. That's not really true. It's much more important about saying why what you said was important. Okay, so what impact does your essay and that book have on the real world? So you might talk about the fact that both texts have been significantly influential on young people, and that they will continue to have an impact on today's audience. And then, because it's a comparative essay, you're going to want to confirm that the 2 texts should be studied together. So here we use a nice buzzword called synergistic value. So what we mean by synergism is that if I studied Cinderella on my own, I'd get so much information out of it. If I studied Shrek on its own, yeah, I'd get some more information out of it. But studying it together is better than the sum of the parts. When you look at them both together, you think of far more things than you would have if you studied each of them individually. So finally, at the end of your essay, keeping in mind that the very last thing you say is probably what's going to leave a lasting impression on your teacher or marker, you want to give a mature comment on the value of the texts and their message for society. So why is it important to think about these things? So you want to leave your marker with something deep to think about. So you might say something along the lines of, ultimately fairy tales represent aspects of ourselves, and in highly repeatable and addictive stories, they continue to pass on our values to our children. So you might say something along those lines that sums up why it's important to think about the messages our fairy tales tell.